Into it. We got a few minutes left here to get started in Nehemiah. We'll pick up a little bit next week and finish Nehemiah and get into Esther. So I don't feel like we're that far behind. Let's see. This is the same slide that we've been looking at. Now we're moving into the Nehemiah period. Of course, recognize Ezra is still around. They're going to be contemporaries for a period of time. Ezra is going to be, maybe latter in terms of his ministry, but overlapping with Artaxerxes. And we've seen this rebuilding, really this ongoing rebuilding project involve the most important thing, and that's rebuilding the church, the temple. And then Ezra's focus on rebuilding the spiritual life and vitality of the people. And then finally, the Nehemiah, who's more of the engineer of the bunch, is interested in adding another wall of protection around the city of Jerusalem, so that the city of Jerusalem itself can be the center of life and vitality of this newly rebuilt covenant community. All right? So that's kind of a contrast between the three. So about 12 years, there's this kind of this gap after the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah start back. So that's all we need to say there. There's another, for those of you who are looking at it in a different format, some of the big dates and events. This chart kind of talks about all the way back to Daniel and some of the deportations that took place, the fall of Jerusalem. You see how these events kind of line up. Persia is going to conquer Babylon in 539. So there's that transition during, when Daniel's, he starts in Babylon, Persia conquers, and then now he's a servant of the Persian court. The Cyrus decree, of course, in 538. And then we have Zerubbabel with this first group that comes back, focusing on the temple. Darius I is going to be the Persian king during this temple opposition, on paralleling these chapters in Ezra 5 and 6 that we looked at, and Daniel, of course, working behind the scenes. Temple's completion in 520, in and around those prophets who are acting behind the scenes, encouraging the people, pushing them to the finish line. And we have that kind of that bracketed out time, Esther's era during the reign of Xerxes in Persia. So she's like Daniel behind the scenes. God's using people all over the place, working behind the scenes, actually. And then we have Ezra showing up, bringing the second group. We just heard from him in his book and his account. It's a first-hand account, just as we'll see in Nehemiah. And that's the third group that comes back in 444. Nehemiah will eventually merge in as serving as a governor of the area, and also overseeing the rebuilding and construction of the walls. And here we have a actual snapshot of him at work rebuilding the walls. Anybody see the significance here? Yeah, Nehemiah. All right, there you go. Right, so that's all we need to say about that. But Ezra and Nehemiah were originally a single book. I talked about that. I think talked about Jerome. One thing I didn't mention before in terms of the historical progression of Ezra and Nehemiah, they originally identified as first Ezra and second Ezra. Jerome, as I said, was the first one to call, actually to be more specific and accurate, he was the first to call second Ezra under the new name Nehemiah. So that's kind of where the break emerges. So first Ezra just becomes Ezra. Nehemiah takes over the title of second Ezra. And these names, Ezra and Nehemiah, were first used in the English printed Geneva Bible, first used in print in the Geneva Bible of 1560. So the book of Nehemiah now covers a 25-year period from 457 to 432. And during this time is a contemporary with the prophet Malachi as well. All right, so working behind the scenes, like what we've seen with Daniel, and like what we will see when we cover the story of Esther, Mordecai. He's another example of a significant Israelite being impactful and working through conflict behind the scenes. It's important to recognize Nehemiah was also in the same kind of genre of significant, working behind the scenes Israelites at that time, at very strategic moments, significant moments in Israelite history. We pick up with Nehemiah. He is risen in terms of serving in the Persian court under King Artaxerxes, and we immediately see the bad news that he receives. Let's look at chapter 1 and pick up his account in verses 1 through 3. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, while I was in Susa, that is the capital of Persia, that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came back, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and survived the captivity and about Jerusalem. And they said, remember there in the province, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach. And the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates burned with fire. So this is the news that he hears from this entourage that's come back. And that's how they carried news in those days before cell phones. So carrying news back and forth that way. You know, we have evidence of Ezekiel, the prophet, who's also hearing news coming back and forth during that time. So the response that we have from Nehemiah, we see it in chapter 1, verse 4. Now it came about when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, I beseech thee, O Lord of God of heaven, the great and awesome God who preserves the covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear now be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, which I am praying before you now, day and night, on behalf of the sons of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the sons of Israel, which we have sinned against you. I and my father's house have sinned. Let's see. I wanted to... I'm going to get into this in a little bit. I'll come back to this. Well, I wanted to say before we get to the prayer, let me just pause right there. One thing I wanted to say. This event of... This news, this bad news that he receives is probably parallel to what we read back in Ezra chapter 4. Remember that little part of it I said that needs to be moved and replaced or relocated in terms of the timeline. So that account where Artaxerxes' decree that we saw evidence of in the text of chapter 4, 7 through 23, to put a stop to the repairs on the walls, and that section of Ezra that's put in Ezra should probably relate to this time period and as the precipitating event when Nehemiah is recognizing that there's a crisis back home that he needs to start praying about and addressing. So we move to his prayer. That's what I wanted to focus on here a little bit. And we look at his prayer, and we won't look at all the details, but we read 5 through 6a. That first part of verse 6 is really... Nehemiah's prayer is really interesting. This whole prayer, you can use it as a kind of a study guide for what prayer should look like. Chapter 5, verses 5 through 6, the first part of 6, is an appeal to who God is. Who is this God? And you see that in Nehemiah's words. And then verse 6b through verse 7, the acknowledgement of sin. And then in this context, he's representing the sins of the whole community. The covenant violation that's according to the words of Moses. And then we have beginning of verse 8 and 9. Here we have a collage of Scripture. Nehemiah is incorporating the very words of Scripture or paraphrases of Scripture text that he is bringing now into his prayer. Verse 8, remember the word which thou commanded thy servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. That's Leviticus 26, verse 33. And then verse 9. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been scattered were in the most remote parts of the heavens, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place where I have chosen to cause my name to dwell. That's from Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 2 through 4, and Deuteronomy 12:5. So all of that happens. You've got the appeal to who God is, the recognition of the great God, who he is. Then you've got the confession of sin, and then you have the interaction with actual text, the words of Scripture, all before he even asked for anything. See? Nehemiah, then his request comes in verse 11. O Lord, I beseech thee, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants, who delight to revere or fear your name, and make your servant successful today, and grant him compassion before this man, the king of Persia. Now, aka, little insertion, I was cupbearer to the king. That's what I was doing when I was praying like this. And here's my question. What does this tell us about Nehemiah? And does it give us a little glimpse into the exilic community back home in Persia? I say home. This is their new home, but their former home back in the former home in Persia. And again, I think it's a lot like, it's interesting to kind of string these together. You've got to have a faithful community, a healthy, vibrant covenant community, somewhere back in Persia to produce a praying saint like this. That's my point. Where does somebody grow up in church learning how to pray like? Well, yeah, I just answered my own question. Growing up in church, praying, hearing the prayers of his faithful grandma and grandpa, perhaps, or his mom and dad, and having someone teach him the very words of Torah. Of course, this was Ezra's focus when he's coming back, so that's evidence of this foundation laid by the prophet Ezekiel is continuing to merge and become this faithful community, such that they're producing Nehemiahs to be like a David, to step out on the battlefield and pray this thing to the ground. This is what we have going on at this significant moment. So I show this picture again. I think I've covered all of this. They don't have a church, obviously. They've got some kind of meeting structure. It reminds me of, in a certain Asian country where I've been many times, it's, the underground church. It might be more like that, where people are meeting in homes and are, having instruction and sharing, coming around each other and praying praying together. They've learned how to pray under duress in situations where they don't have all the resources. They're the underdog, and political situations could be turned on a dime, not in their favor. But in this case, you must have the praying saints. Things like this are happening because there are people, I think, praying behind the scenes. We don't hear all of their stories, but we meet up with Nehemiah. In Nehemiah chapter 2, the details to the answered prayer are given in verses 1 through 9. And Nehemiah says, it came about in the 9th month, Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is something but sadness of heart. And then I was very much afraid, and I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate, and its gates have been consumed by fire? Then the king said to me, what would you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven, quickest prayer on record, and I said to the king, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Then the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will your journey be, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time, because he was a detail guy. And I said to the king, if it please the king, let the letters be given to me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah. So remember that route? You've got, permission for this, for Nehemiah, and he's going to have people going with him. So he's asking for the protection of the whole group who are coming through the provinces beyond the river Euphrates. That's the reference there to the Euphrates, and then down along the water route. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest. So yeah, Nehemiah is a great illustration. I'm sure you've probably heard good sermons on Nehemiah in terms of he's an organizer. He knows he's a project guy. He knows how to get things done. He's a great example of spiritual leadership as well. He's organizing this thing. He recognizes, I'm going to have some resources available to me when I get back. So I'm going to ask the king for it now. Give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress, which is the temple, and for the wall of the city, for the house to which I will go. And the king granted them to me because of the good hand of my God was upon me. So he's got everything working together. And verse 10. See, do we want to go there yet? So Nehemiah is sent to Jerusalem with the letters of authorization to build and acquire building supplies and from the king's forest. But already we see in verse 10 it's not going to be easy. Just like what we saw with Zerubbabel and the opposition that was from the very beginning, this is continuing to continue in verse 10. And then when Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about it, it was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the shalom or the welfare of the sons of Israel. All right? So this is the scenario that we have. And I think before we get into the details of Nehemiah's great oversight and engineering mind, I really appreciate Nehemiah because I have an engineering background and I see the strategicness in which he thinks through things and plans things and brings it all together. We'll hold off until next week for that. So, all right. Thanks for your attention today. We'll have the video links posted and the group discussion question and the reading quiz for Ezra and Nehemiah posted in a little bit.